A photograph surfaces from the depths of a deleted file. It should not exist. No one was meant to find it. Yet there it is, a young woman, bound with duct tape, her face streaked with blood and terror, her eyes searching desperately for someone, anyone, who might intervene. The man who took that photograph was sitting less than 2 feet away from her. He did nothing. He watched. And when investigators finally pulled that image from a temporary cache, buried inside a smartphone's forgotten architecture, the last illusion of McKinley Louisa's innocence disintegrated completely. That photograph is where this story arrives at its most devastating truth. But to understand how a 20-year-old woman named Melody Hoffman, a woman who once told a stranger she admired her sweater simply because she wanted to see her smile, ended up bound and bleeding in the backseat of a Honda Accord on a frigid February night, we must travel backward. We must examine the architecture of deception, the geometry of cruelty, and the extraordinary investigative machinery that ultimately dismantled 2 killers with surgical precision. Marion, Iowa sits in the eastern corridor of the state, pressed close against Cedar Rapids like a quiet suburb that never quite grew into its own ambitions. Its streets are orderly. Its crime statistics are modest. The people who raise families there do so with a particular confidence. The confidence that comes from living somewhere the worst things seem to happen to someone else, somewhere else, in some other city with some other set of problems. Marion is the kind of place where unlocked cars and trusting neighbors are not merely habits but philosophies. It is precisely the kind of place where what happened to Melody Hoffman feels not just criminal, but cosmically wrong. A violation not only of law, but of the unspoken social contract that holds small communities together. On the morning of February 18, 2024, a caller reached emergency dispatch for Iowa County with a voice caught somewhere between disbelief and dread. The caller had stumbled upon something at Lily Lake, a small, largely unknown recreational area near the Amana colonies. A park so tucked away that the investigator who would later lead the case admitted he had lived in the region most of his life without knowing the location existed. That obscurity was not incidental. It was chosen. Whoever brought Melody Hoffman to that shoreline knew the landscape. They understood which places swallowed sound, which tree lines blocked sight lines, which gravel roads dissolved into darkness without witness. The caller described a woman lying face down at the water's edge, wearing only undergarments, motionless. When deputies arrived and taped off the perimeter, they confronted a scene of sustained, intimate violence. Slash marks carved into her back in patterns too deliberate to be incidental. Stab wounds. Ligature marks encircling both her wrists and her neck. The bruised geography of restraint and asphyxiation. A bruise had bloomed across the left side of her face. A cut marked her middle finger. The medical examiner's findings would confirm what the scene already declared. Melody Hoffman had been strangled to death, and critically, her wounds had not bled post-mortem. Her heart had already stopped before the blade ever touched her skin. Whatever happened at Lily Lake was not the beginning of her ordeal. It was the end. Investigators noticed something else at that shoreline, something that oriented the entire subsequent investigation. Melody carried no identification, no wallet, no phone. But she wore a class ring, and etched into that ring was her name, Melody Hoffman. 20 years old, a Marion resident, a young woman who had navigated the world with a mild intellectual disability that her mother, Megan, described not as a limitation, but as a texture, something that required a little more patience, a little more guidance, but never diminished what Melody was capable of or who she was. She had graduated high school. She loved animals and children. She thrived on connection with others, adults especially, with a warmth that strangers felt within minutes of meeting her. At almost the same moment that deputies were processing the scene at Lily Lake, Megan Hoffman arrived at the Marion Police Department to file a missing persons report for her daughter. The collision of those two facts, the body at the lake, The mother at the station compressed the early hours of the investigation into a single devastating revelation that investigators had to deliver to a woman already brittle with fear. The words were spoken. Megan heard them. And then, as she would later describe it, much of what followed became a blur. But the investigation had no time for stillness. The clock that governs evidence, the one that measures surveillance footage retention in days, cell tower data in hours, digital footprints in minutes, was already running. Investigators needed a timeline. They needed to understand where Melody had been, who she had been with, and what sequence of decisions had carried her from her mother's home to that frozen shoreline 30 miles away. Megan's account of the previous night constructed the first scaffolding of that timeline. She had been tracking Melody through a location-sharing application called Life 360, a practice common among parents of young adults navigating an independence that comes with its own vulnerabilities. Around 11 p.m. on February 17th, Megan received a notification that Melody had departed the home's established safe zone. Melody had told her she would return. She asked her mother to leave the door unlocked. Megan, with the practical vigilance of a mother who understood her daughter's trusting nature, locked the door at 11:30 and told Melody to call when she was close. What followed was a sequence of digital communications that Megan would later describe as increasingly off. Snapchat messages arrived, framed as Melody's voice but wrong in their cadence, wrong in their phrasing, wrong in the particular way that only someone who has spent years decoding another person's written voice could identify. "Am down the street. Am coming home soon." Melody did not write that way. Melody did not use am as a sentence opener, but McKinley Louisma did. Forensic analysts would later confirm what Megan already suspected in her gut, that by midnight, Melody was no longer the one typing. Someone else had taken her phone. Someone was managing her digital presence, constructing an illusion of normalcy while the reality beneath it was something no mother should ever have to imagine. At 3:13 in the morning, Megan's phone erupted with an emergency alert from Apple. Crash detection. Melody's phone had registered an impact severe enough to trigger an automatic distress signal, dispatching emergency notifications to the 4 people Melody had designated, including her Aunt Daisy, who reached the GPS coordinates first. Daisy and her husband found nothing. No crumpled metal, no broken glass, no skid marks, just an empty rural road and the sound of their own footsteps on cold asphalt. Megan drove herself to the location. She rolled down her window and listened. She heard something, faint, directional, getting louder as she walked toward it. A glow on the white line at the road's edge. Melody's phone, face down, its back shattered into a mosaic of broken glass. No phone case. Megan had always insisted on a phone case. Its absence was one more wrong note in a night constructed entirely of wrong notes. She gathered the phone and drove directly to the police station. Investigators already had a name before Megan finished speaking. She offered it without hesitation. McKinley Louisma, 23 years old. Melody's first serious romantic partner, a relationship that had crystallized with unexpected speed after they connected through Facebook's dating feature in November of 2023. Within weeks, Louisma had become a fixture in the Hoffman household, eating meals there, sleeping there, present enough that Megan had formed her own assessment of him. He seemed in those early months like someone who genuinely cared for her daughter. The dissolution came in December. Louisma had been ghosting Melody with increasing frequency, promising to arrive, failing to materialize, offering excuses that grew thinner with each repetition. Megan had urged Melody to confront him directly. The confrontation produced a breakup that Melody absorbed badly. She had attached herself to this relationship with the full sincerity she brought to everything, and its unraveling left her exposed. What she did not know, what no one in her immediate circle knew, was that Louisma had returned to a woman named Nakia Sloboda, a 4-year on-again, off-again relationship that was suddenly very much back on because Nakia was pregnant. In early January 2024, roughly a month before Melody's body was discovered, an anonymous text message reached her phone from a number that could not be traced, a disposable device purchased specifically to avoid accountability. The message was vile. It threatened her life explicitly. It promised that law enforcement could not shield her at all hours. It described painting her house red with blood. Marion police investigated. The temporary phone yielded nothing traceable. The case went cold in the administrative sense, filed as a threat without a traceable source, even as Megan retained the certainty of someone who trusted her own fear. Now investigators understood why she had been so certain when she said McKinley's name. The timeline of that threatening text aligned precisely with a particular inflection point in Melody and McKinley's deteriorating post-breakup relationship. Specifically, the day Melody threatened to discard possessions he had left at the apartment. He retrieved those belongings, and within the same day the anonymous threat arrived. Cedar Rapids police located Louisma's vehicle first, a blue 2007 Honda Accord parked in a trailer park in Hiawatha. They seized it and transported it to Marion, where investigators applied for a search warrant. While that warrant processed through the legal machinery, Louisma called the station himself. He wanted to know about his car. The audacity of that call, the performance of the confused, cooperative citizen, would read very differently by the end of the day. Louisma came in voluntarily. He sat across from investigators and constructed his first version of events with the careful architecture of someone who has rehearsed it. He acknowledged the relationship with Melody. He acknowledged the breakup. He said he had not seen her on the night in question. He had a new girlfriend. He had a child coming. He had no reason to be anywhere near Melody Hoffman. For approximately 45 minutes, he said, he had loaned his car to someone he did not know very well. Other than that, he had been home playing video games. The search warrant came through. Investigators approached the Honda and conducted a preliminary exterior examination before opening anything. Near the trunk's keyhole, a small dark speck interrupted the paint. It appeared to be blood. They opened the trunk. Inside, a green garbage bag sat against the left wall of the cargo space. When investigators parted the plastic, a loop of duct tape came into view, and adhered to that tape unmistakably was a clump of human hair. What emerged from that bag over the next several minutes constituted one of the most damning assemblages of physical evidence in recent Iowa criminal history. Melody Hoffman's clothing, her shoes, her Apple Watch band. Receipts from a Walmart purchase. Packaging from 2 machetes. Duct tape marked with blood. Melody's phone case, the case Megan had insisted upon, the absence of which had told her something was catastrophically wrong. And a length of paracord, tightly woven, the kind of rope that tightens efficiently and leaves distinctive marks on skin. Investigators sent photographs to Megan for identification. She recognized the phone case immediately, the same way a mother recognizes her child's handwriting or the sound of their footsteps on stairs. She knew. Louisma, still at the station, requested a second conversation with investigators. His first account, he now admitted, had been incomplete. He had omitted details to protect his family from a dangerous third party. He introduced a new character, Dakota Van Patten, who went by Dakota. A friend. Someone he had been with that night. Someone who, according to this revised account, had orchestrated everything at gunpoint, compelling McKinley through terror to participate in acts he had no desire to commit. The second account was elaborate. It described a plan to go off-roading that transitioned without warning into something monstrous. It described a BB gun wielded as if it were lethal. It described McKinley as a reluctant captive in his own vehicle, forced to retrieve duct tape from his own trunk, forced to restrain a woman he cared about, forced to drive to a location he knew, forced to stand at the water's edge and listen to the sound of someone choking. He claimed helplessness. He claimed fear. He claimed he had no opportunities to act. Investigators listened, then they pushed back. They enumerated the opportunities, Stop signs on rural roads between the Amana colonies, places where a driver might glance away, where a person sitting behind him with a knife might make a different choice. Stretches of darkness where a car door could be thrown open and a body could tumble free. Moments when Dakota was distracted, occupied, facing the other direction. Louisma had explanations for none of them that held together under pressure. His narrative kept shifting. He contradicted himself within the same interview. He had told investigators he had checked his trunk after returning home. Then he said he hadn't. Then he couldn't remember. There was something else. Investigators had deliberately withheld from Louisma the specific manner of Melody's death. They had not told him she was strangled. When he described the sound he claimed to have heard from a distance while standing by the car, someone choking, the unmistakable acoustic signature of strangulation, he had revealed knowledge that only a witness to that act could possess. He had been there. He had heard it. And whatever the geometry of coercion he was constructing, he had heard it, and he had not moved. Then the gun question. The weapon Louisma claimed Dakota had used to dominate him throughout the entire night. The firearm that had reduced a grown man to paralytic compliance for several hours across multiple locations was a BB gun. Investigators recovered it from the residence Louisma shared with Nakia on Hummingbird Lane. They also found photographs Dakota had taken of himself with it, selfies in the front seat of McKinley's car, casual and grinning. McKinley Louisma had known that gun was not real. He had known it the entire time. Louisma was arrested that night and charged with first-degree kidnapping. Investigators moved next to Dakota Van Patten. He arrived at the Marion Police Department for questioning and immediately projected an affect of bewilderment, the performance of someone who has just learned that gravity works differently than they assumed. He denied knowing Melody Hoffman. He denied any involvement in a homicide. He expressed disbelief that McKinley, whom he characterized as gentle and non-confrontational, could participate in anything violent. He offered his girlfriend, Tiara Meyer, as an alibi, saying he had gone to her home that night and stayed. But Tiara Meyer's account did not exonerate him. It placed him at her residence, yes, but after Melody was already dead. And at some point during that visit, Dakota Van Patten told Tiara what he had done. He confessed. He had been present. He had participated. And then, apparently, he had gone to his girlfriend's house and unburdened himself of the knowledge that he had just helped kill a 20-year-old woman. Surveillance footage from Walmart filled in the hours before the kidnapping with a clarity that no alibi could survive. 3 men entered the store: McKinley Louisma, Dakota Van Patten, Logan Kimpton, a man who served as the social connective tissue between the other two, the cousin of Louisma's longtime girlfriend, the friend who had introduced McKinley and Dakota. The footage captured all 3 moving through the sporting goods section, selecting 2 Ozark Trail machetes, selecting 2 pairs of Ozark Trail gloves. The packaging for those machetes was found in the trunk of Louisma's car. The gloves were found in that same green garbage bag alongside Melody's blood-soaked possessions. The footage also showed something that investigators found particularly damning in its casualness. The 3 men were sometimes smiling. They walked through a retail store selecting instruments of violence with the relaxed body language of people running errands. Logan Kimpton was subsequently dropped home before the night's events accelerated. But he had been there. He had stood in that aisle. Phone data and Life 360 records allowed investigators to reconstruct the night with granular precision. Melody left her mother's home at approximately 11 p.m. She was picked up by Louisma and Van Patten at 11:24 p.m. Her Apple Watch registered a cardiac event and a loud noise alert, the kind of threshold sound that the device registers at around 120 decibels, at approximately 12:03 a.m. Her heart rate spiked. Then her heart stopped. This event did not occur at Lily Lake. The geolocation data placed it at Morgan Creek Park, a different location entirely, closer to the Cedar Rapids area, a place Louisma knew because he had brought Melody there before. What happened at Lily Lake was a disposal. What happened at Morgan Creek Park was a murder. After Melody was dead, the two men drove back toward the city. They stopped at a convenience store. They used the restroom. They purchased cigars. They celebrated. Investigators reviewed that footage too. Two men behind the counter's glass, exchanging money for tobacco. A transaction completed with the mechanical normalcy of people who have just finished a long shift of ordinary work. The DNA evidence that returned from processing removed any residual ambiguity about Van Patten's direct physical participation. Inside one of the Ozark trail gloves, the outside of which bore Melody Hoffman's blood, analysts identified Dakota Van Patten's DNA on the interior surface. The man who wore that glove while Melody's blood was on the outside of it was Dakota Van Patten. A partially consumed roll of duct tape recovered from the console of Louisma's car yielded the same result. Van Patten's DNA on the inside of the roll, Melody's blood on the exterior surface. The paracord, the length of rope investigators identified as the likely murder weapon, carried Melody's DNA and the DNA of two additional individuals. The only two people confirmed to have been with Melody Hoffman at the time of her death were McKinley Louisma and Dakota Van Patten. A subsequent search warrant executed at the residence where Van Patten had been staying produced Melody's glasses from the bedroom. A machete consistent with the Ozark Trail products they had purchased was recovered. In the basement, a rope that appeared to match the remaining section of the cordage found in Louisma's trunk, consistent with a single length cut in two, was located. And then there was what Van Patten had done with Melody's glasses. He had not merely taken them as a souvenir. He had put them on. He had photographed himself wearing them, approximately 200 photographs, some of which he had transmitted to others via Snapchat. The glasses of a woman he had helped murder, worn as an accessory, documented obsessively. Whatever psychological architecture produced that behavior, prosecutors would use those photographs to demonstrate to a jury the absence of remorse, the presence of something that defied ordinary comprehension. McKinley Louisma faced trial first. Prosecutors framed him as the architect, the person with history, motive, and intimate knowledge of both Melody's habits and the geographic landscape where her body was found. They outlined multiple possible motives. The bitterness of a breakup received badly. The existential pressure of a pregnant girlfriend who may have delivered an ultimatum about Melody's continued presence in his life. And something else. Something the prosecution surfaced near the end of the evidentiary phase. The possibility that Melody had been pregnant at the time of her death, or had recently been pregnant, introducing a dimension of complication and desperation into Louisma's calculus that the jury was asked to consider. His defense attorney argued that Louisma had not strangled Melody, had not beaten her, had not killed her, that the act itself, the strangulation, the final violence, was Van Patten's and Van Patten's alone, and that participation in an event was not the same as commission of the crime. The prosecution countered by invoking the legal architecture of conspiracy and accomplice liability, that a man who purchases the weapons, drives the vehicle, restrains the victim, and handles the bloody evidence is not a bystander. He is a participant, regardless of whose hands closed around whose neck. The jury deliberated for 2 hours. Guilty on all counts. First-degree murder, first-degree kidnapping, conspiracy to commit a forcible felony. At sentencing, Megan Hoffman addressed the man who had eaten at her table and slept in her daughter's home. She told him he had miscalculated her family. She told him that Melody, even now, was providing for him, providing the bars behind which he would spend the remainder of his natural life in prison without possibility of parole. The judge confirmed what the mathematics of the sentence already communicated. McKinley Louisma would die incarcerated. Dakota Van Patten's trial commenced on September 17, 2025. His defense strategy pivoted on the distinction between presence and participation, and on redirecting culpability toward Louisma, positioning Van Patten as a young man who had been in the wrong place, making wrong decisions, dominated by someone else's violence and someone else's motive. The prosecution dismantled that framework piece by piece. The glove with his DNA inside, the duct tape with his DNA inside, the photographs of himself wearing a murdered woman's glasses, the confession delivered to Tierra Meyer within hours of the killing, his own admission at the store when investigators confronted him with the fact that his phone had connected to Melody's phone, placing him at the scene he denied ever inhabiting. Guilty on all counts. November 14th, 2025. Life without parole. Logan Kimpton, who had stood in that Walmart aisle and helped select the instruments, was arrested on conspiracy charges. The full weight of what had been planned in that retail store aisle settled over the proceedings like a physical object. The lead prosecutor, a man who had spent 25 years handling homicides, described the ritual he follows after every conviction, a private moment taken to let the reality of the loss settle back in beneath the adrenaline. He said this case would remain with him for the length of his career, not because of its complexity, though the investigative architecture was formidable, not because of the evidence, though it was overwhelming, but because Melody Hoffman should still be alive, because the particular goodness she carried through the world, the instinct to make strangers smile, the love for animals and babies and everyone she encountered, the sincerity with which she trusted people, should have been protected, not exploited. Megan Hoffman carries the weight of a specific memory, Melody in a mall at Christmas time, approaching a stranger and complimenting her sweater with such genuine warmth that the woman's face transformed. When Megan asked Melody afterward whether she had really liked the sweater, Melody had looked at her with the kind of clarity that can look like simplicity, but is actually something much rarer, something closer to wisdom. "No," she said. She just wanted to see her smile. That was it. That was the full extent of Melody's transaction with the world. She wanted to see people smile. The last video Megan received from Melody before the Snapchat messages began arriving in a voice that wasn't hers was footage of Melody in the back seat of a car, dancing, moving to music in the dark interior of someone else's vehicle, in the last hours before the darkness became total and irreversible. That image, Melody dancing, Melody smiling, Melody being entirely herself right up to the edge of what was coming, has become, in the telling of this story, its most enduring frame. Not the crime scene photographs, not the courtroom footage, not the evidence bags lined up on a processing table. Just a young woman in a back seat, dancing because she felt like dancing, because the music was on and the night was still young and she was still, for a few more hours, entirely alive. We need more people like Melody Hoffman in the world. She was taken from it by men who could not comprehend what they were destroying. 2 juries understood, 2 judges spoke the sentence, and the bars are now permanent.